So this is the final reading of the philosophy of Mannerism by Sjoerd van Taunen. We're reading from Renewed Materialism. Perhaps the metaphysical core of Mannerist design can be summed up as follows. There is creation everywhere, but not everything is created or designed. Is this betting on the alchemy or metabolism of informal creative processes, the ideology of today's hackerspaces, in which the post-Fordist economy feeds on sharing and tinkering? Is it just the goodwill of pathological progressives, or even of the creative class in general, from Silicon Valley employees to the new artistic researchers? Or does it also offer a way of reclaiming creativity from professionals and established institutions? That is, from everybody who profits from the way it is currently conditioned. Today, after decades of postmodern idealism or culturalism, we are witnessing a new materialism. To be a cultural materialist means to refrain from explaining things by, and thus reducing them to, what they are not. Instead of explaining works of art by reducing them to a mirror of socio-cultural norms, economic interests, linguistic conventions, or religious convictions, we turn to the works themselves in their tangible, sensual, non-conceptual, and non-anthropocentric reality. We do not learn about things by interpreting them in anthropocentric terms. Rather, we learn about ourselves by learning from things. Ideally, this is what field work, as opposed to laboratory experimentation, in science or practice-based research, as opposed to doing theory, in art means. The new importance attached to tinkering in design, a matter of fooling with things, with the street, the city, the society, life itself, is matched by the renewed interest in metallurgy and the science of materials in science and technology studies. A material such as metal is a relation with a milieu, and for this reason, it cannot be idealized in terms of general microscopic models such as quarks, the Higgs boson, or black holes, nor can it be exhaustively understood in terms of the macroscopic phase diagrams of liquids, crystals, or other bodies with generic qualities. Rather, it is always this or that aggregate. Not a matter of theory or fact, but a matter of practical concern. It exists in a mesoscopic field of varying scale, in which it is no longer possible to distinguish between the human and non-human elements, but in which we move back and forth between quantum physics, thermodynamics, corrosion chemistry, crystallography, and management strategy. Of course, if cultural materialism is to become a real movement and not just remain an idea, it has to go beyond the goodwill of some pre-established subjective attitude. As Manuel de Landa has repeatedly argued, whereas hylomorphism is always mind-dependent, material entities are mind-independent. Only what is mind-independent must be produced in the slowness and unpredictability of historical, evolutionary, embryological, and physico-chemical processes. Practice-based, we therefore also become object-orientated. What Graham Harman has called tool being is the epiphany of the craftsperson, the disconcerting experience that his tools and materials exert their own reality and possess a vitality far beyond the subject-object correlation. Is this not what we have previously described as matter rising up to sensation in a kind of tingling or quiver. When things appear in the mode of being of readiness to hand, Zuhanden, as Heidegger says, as opposed to present to hand, Vorhanden, we can only use them by allying ourselves with their autonomous propensity. While they generally vanish and lose their singularity in the general equipmental effect, they regain their precognitive allure at the moment they break. This is why the proponents of object-oriented ontology see object-orientedness as a relation that is neither theoretical nor practical, but aesthetic, with Harman and Stephen Shaviro approaching this presence from the side of beauty, and Timothy Morton approaching it from the side of the sublime. But as we have seen, the opposition between beautiful and sublime itself really only persists from the perspective of the intellect. Either way, aesthetics is the sensibility or feeling of an object for its sheer sincerity of existence. Perhaps the necessity of breaking down the traditional theory-practice schema is also where the contemporary rupture with alchemy and metallurgy takes place, and a breakthrough becomes possible that is not just aesthetic, but first of all technical. Alchemy is an art of combinations that precipitates the event in non-generalizable experiments in which both the subject and the object are at stake, but it still puts its trust in a vital, perhaps we can call it romantic, liaison between humans and their world. Today, more than in the past, the hylomorphic division of labor implies a scission of action and a kind of alienation, such as becomes clear from the fear of robots taking over work. As Simondon has argued, even the domination of humans over humans derives from this more fundamental domination of humans over nature, rather than vice versa. The original coming into being of the alienation between man and nature is due to a phase shift away from magical unity or friendship between figure individuals and ground, the pre-individual potential of nature, toward a distinction capable of modifying itself in secondary individuations. The new distinction consists of a divergence of technicity and religion. Modern technology is a machine that no longer prolongs the corporeal schema of work and replaces it with a technical schematism. In pre-industrial artisanal production, the use value of technical objects prevails in the confrontation between the coherence of the technical work and the needs of utility, whereas in industrial production, the object's own operational functioning becomes dominant and its instrumentalization becomes secondary. There is a convergence of economic constraints, diminished quantity of raw material, of work, and of energy consumption before use, and technical requirements. Today, there is no nature outside of technology, just as technology is no longer merely prosthetic, but itself becomes the ground in contradistinction to the figure. Every nature, too, is a second nature. However, Simondon stresses that the problem is not the annihilation of use value. The technical object is an even deeper state, the technical object is in an even deeper state of alienation than economic or social alienation in that it becomes opaque to its users and is treated merely as a functional object or slave. It would therefore be a mistake to think that a collectivization of property relations could relieve us. These relations may be intrinsic to the work paradigm, but they are incomplete with respect to the technical object. Labour and capital are both late with respect to the technical individual that is a depository of technicity. The source of alienation does not lie outside work, but in work itself, because it is the functioning of technology as such that is obscured. The work paradigm is hylomorphic in that it masks the relation in favor of the terms of form and matter, thus installing a knowledge gap between manufacturer and user. The point of view of technological knowledge, by contrast, insists in starting from what happens inside the mold. As a correction to Bergson's strict division between intellect and intuition, and its related understanding of technology as unidirectional imposition of ideas on matter, Simondon speaks of technical objects in the same genetic mode. As we talk about living beings, aesthetic objects, and physico-chemical systems. This enables him to show that the technical schematism involves not only intellect, but also intuition. Just as there is novelty, even in the correlate of the intellect, matter, engineers must be sentient. Their knowledge is an active knowledge that combines invention with ongoing adjustment and organization and use. Where construction and use converge, the hierarchies between the manual and the intellectual, or science and technology, disappear. The work to be done for Simondon is the ever further integration of technology and culture. Instead of returning to a magical unity, but also instead of relying on art, as in Romanticism, it is only through techniques that we may come to construct a new modality of the relation of humans to things, and in this way also of new trans-individual relations among ourselves. For labour to become a collective activity again, it must take on a position in the technical network that binds human and non-human actors alike. It would have to be possible to discover a social and economic mode whereby the user of the technical object would not only be the owner of this machine, but also the man who chooses it and who maintains it. In other words, the responsibility, delicacy, and care of an intuition that transports us into the interior of things themselves must be based on a continuity of operation across various thresholds of technical functioning. Just as the operative knowledge of metals belongs as much to the doctor and the armourer as to the sculptor, miner, or watchmaker, technical knowledge must learn how to enter into the spontaneous interplay of construction and alterations of its objects. The technical object is a stable mix of the human and the natural. It gives its human content a structure similar to that of natural objects and allows the insertion in the world of causes and natural effects of this human reality. A convertibility of the human into the natural and the natural into the human is instituted through the technical schematism, which thus replaces work as the fundamental metabolic function and conditions a new materialism that takes the form of a new transcendental philosophy. This means, first, that today's fascination with handwork should not be confused with the nostalgia for the transparency of the crafted product with respect to its production. After all, Marx had already pointed out that production cannot be rendered visible or absorbed in the product. Representation always comes too late, since the product of production is the plane of representation as such. As Sebastian Egenhofer argues, a contemporary production aesthetics therefore does not imply a preference for handiwork or the unicity of a work in the age of serial reproduction. Rather, it starts from the fissure between representation and becoming, having to deal with the having become of the real, as well as its means of reproduction and representation. The notion of the vibrancy of matter is perhaps only the sublime cipher of this disparity, whereas metamodern craftsmanship expresses an impatience with the paralysis, as for example, in climate change skepticism, caused by our inability to imagine the coming about of integrated world capitalism, euphemistically known as globalization. A second lesson is that artisanal imagination does not develop freely, and that its efficacy depends on the resistance and ambiguity it meets. Its generic processual character only really loses its descriptive generality and acquires force when aberrant movements deform our habitual schemata. The artisan is interesting to the extent that she is engaged in a bodily combat with reality, deciding in split seconds, not by measuring and talking, but by learning from contingency and constraint. This is why the Mannerists valued virtuosity, virtuosità, and the speed of execution, prestezza, above all. This love of speed must be understood in conjunction with the equally Mannerist will to difficulty, difficolta, the intense exploration of the liminal zone between raw material and pure form. We need to get rid of the classical conflict between necessity and freedom. Bergson stresses that intuition is averse to facility, since it involves a tense dialectic between many possible durations. To intuit something is more a decrease than an increase of control. Life for Palissy is not just swift, elegant movement, but also the slow fermenting process of a swamp. There is no grace without potential violence, since it means to be caught in the constituent acts of others full of contrasts. If you would own grace instead of passing it on, it would degrade into slickness or virtuosity. Mannerist sprezzatura, or ease, does not sprout from easiness, but from difficulty. Everyone knows the difficulty of things that are exquisite and well done. So to have the facility in such things gives rise to the greatest wonder. In a culture of rapid change, likewise, slow movement does not equal a lack of speed. In fact, there is neither virtuosity nor difficulty in microsecond calculation on Wall Street. Rather, slowing down is a particular assemblage of speed, an asynchronization of the present. Speed exists in direct connection with the contingency and roughness of material flux, such that there can be no authority of skill without an intrusion of indeterminacy and otherness that slows down the question of failure and success. Hence, the oscillation between the two irreducible moments of aesthetics, the sublime and the beautiful, or between the sense of intrusion and the feeling of sympathy. Only when our relation to the world is problematized by the disparity of materials can we profit from affordances and befriend resistance with only minimal force. Vice versa, we cannot immediately relate to the infinite and must attune with vital processes through finite composition. This was already Ruskin's aesthetic and non-ideological critique of capitalism. Perhaps this demand for proportionality also implies that we finally have to rid ourselves of the concept of design if we want to understand what is revolutionary about craftsmanship. If design is about problem solving and operativity, craftsmanship is about problem finding and inoperativity. Instead of industrial standardization, its goal is to produce otherness, something we have previously called consistency. The task is laborious, but perhaps the diligence and doggedness of the technocrafters in their recalcitrant persistence to achieve a purpose are capable of reclaiming time from its rational homogenization. Their time is the time of the indetermination of life. Their speed is one of self-animation and self-maintenance. Their science is the humble science of interstices and cracks. In other words, a science of defects and tortuous learning about their métier. They articulate something beyond the good intentions and optimism of design, and beyond the postmodern fascination with the technical sublime. Namely, that learning is not only about how to do things, but also why you are doing them and with whom. Whereas Rem Koolhaas's affirmation of the infinite, for example, still tends towards a cynical expansion of scientificism. Crafters know that there comes a point when you can't improve by doing better. Finitude becomes more important than the sublime. There is no general response, only the informal compromises in which we become a machine among other machines, or one manner of producing coherence in matter among others. The artisan is cosmic precisely to the extent that he participates in this interstitial, self-reflective space of a mannered nature, that is, a civic, urban, and modern earth.
There was one aspect to this line. Either way, aesthetics is the sensibility or feeling of an object for its sheer sincerity of existence. I just finished watching the Eames documentary, The Architect and the Painter, and there was this quote by Janine Opewall in the documentary that I thought aligned with this pretty well, where she was talking about Charles and Ray Eames's film Tops, which is just about the life of spinning tops. And basically, she says that the film goes into what is the essence of a top and how you really get to this essence when the film gets to a thumbtack which spins around a blueprint. And at one point, she says, things have meaning, things have personality, things express ideas. And I felt like that quote from Janine Opewall really gets at the sense of object-oriented ontology and new materialism fairly well, which is something that Sejord is talking about a lot in this last chapter. Virtuosity. In Mannerism, the artisan is traditionally said to part ways with the anonymous swamp of his colleagues and emerge into the solitary figure of the artist under the sole authority of originality. Of course, it was lucrative to have this authority. Outside the guild orbit of assay and raw material, goldsmiths such as Lucas Cranach the Elder, Vasari, Ghiberti, Botticelli, and Verrocchio made more money as artists than their peers in crafts. The artist's dependency on the market and the public misunderstanding that came with it quickly led to heightened self-consciousness. However, originality does not equal autonomy. The newly gained inner life came at the price of social estrangement. Vasari's Lives reads like an early modern taxonomy of the pathologies of the artist's psyche. Worse still, individual autonomy leads to a loss of speed and agency, or indeed of a fundamental crisis of belief in the world. The master's own mastery changed in content. Claims for his distinctiveness and originality now posed a motivational problem for him. This becomes abundantly clear from post-Fordist conditions of labor, where managers have seized the image of the creative artist for themselves and demand from the people on the ground to mirror themselves in it. The illusion that everybody can be a designer without appropriate training in fact reveals that, whereas the workshop was a recipe for binding people together in a way that enabled them to deal face-to-face with issues of authority and mastery, originality is bad for coherence at almost every level of our relations, those to ourselves, those to others, and those to our physical environments. In craft, to emphasize one more time, this means that you do not begin with an abstract idea and then translate it onto work. In design, aesthetic virtuality is the correlate of plastic invention, which is never a given power but also in/under construction itself. Making is thinking. Moreover, design is not just about making or imitating things, it is also about making ourselves. Taking up Foucault's classic argument for an ethico-aesthetics of the self, Sennett stresses that form pertains to subjectivity no less than to objectivity. Who we are arises directly from what our bodies can do. Social consequences are built into the structure and the functioning of the human body, as in the workings of the human hand. Here, another aspect of craft becomes important: collective discipline, or the convergence of design and use, production and exercise. There can be no mastery of design without constant rehearsal. To make is to practice. In the words of Anish Kapoor, in the end, what one's working with is oneself. Every piece of sculpture, every drawing, every painting is a kind of chemistry. It's like an alchemy. The contemporary artisanal turn points, then, to the compelling question, provoked by meta-modern conditions, of how we must shape our lives together with others in a network and media society. Instead of rejecting the allegation that their craft amounted to mere work, the Mannerists related sculpture's exercises to a spiritual presence. The repetitive training of skill in Mannerism was part of a more general revival of interest in exercises of man on himself through one medium or another. The autobiography of Cellini, that great anti-Vasari, reads as a sort of care of the self based on esercizi or lavori by which he elevates himself from the profane to the sacred. Disegno for him was not the end of knowledge, but the learning curve that leads to grace. It made his art significant not just as a form or idea, but as a work, an opera. As such, it stands at the very intersection of sculpture and morality. Virtuosity is directly related to virtue. If intuition is a feeling of sympathy that transports us into the interior becoming of things themselves, then mastery is inseparable from a responsibility from what is being brought forth. As Agamben points out, while for Aristotle neither virtuous actions nor virtuous beings exist, virtue is the mode of existence of both. What is virtuous is use, something between being and acting, the virtuality of operative habit. It is inseparable from delicate and tender care for an existential urge which is not simply ours, but of which we nonetheless form an inextricable part and on the continuation of which we depend. For this reason, contemporary political theorists from Sennett to Sloterdijk and from Bernard Stiegler to Paulo Verno have rediscovered craftsmanship as a model for an engaged life. Under the real subsumption of labor by capital, public life no longer transcends manual labor, as Hannah Arendt thought. Instead, it is an integral skilling that they find the conditions for civic maturity. For more than the mere acquisition of competence, a skill makes us experience the effect of how we connect and cohere. Craftsmanship, in this sense, is the new guise for the pedagogy of the senses. As enacted intuition, it triggers an abstract or mannerist sensibility. It produces the media literacy, eco-literacy, cosmo-literacy, which transforms isolated individuals into sociable beings. Medial, ecological, cosmological subjectification and agencement of the inter more than intersubjectivity means becoming individual in realizing trans-individuality. Concretely, this implies that people are prepared to take responsibility for the effects of how they interact on a specific scale. Acquiring skills and cultivating relationships are aspects of a medial enlightenment and an eco-emancipation or cosmo-emancipation. If ecology is the science of multiplicities, disparate casualties, and unintentional creations of meanings, it becomes political when practices, out of their own efficacy and immanence, create agency in making people realize their interdependency. In literally being essay, the in-between being interested. For like virtue, virtuosity is irreducibly public or virtual. Being neither the property of a subject nor the quality of his actions, a virtue's only mode of reality is that of virtuous use. Even when our habits are enacted mainly in the disciplined and controlled manner of private subjectivity, we are only the individuations of the relations of which we are composed and through which we inhabit the world. Thus, whereas conscious intentionality is temporarily dephased from the agency of its media, no matter whether these are natural or made up of sophisticated algorithms, the mastery of skilled labor triggers an agency that makes us interested and could even provide a sense of dignity in performing our own collective subjectification. The point is not that craftsmanship would be a model for the politics that might follow from it. Their relation to is a matter of meta-modelization or reciprocal deterritorialization, which can straddle any number of domains and extend into all sorts of crossovers. But the return of craftsmanship does offer a key to understanding the present, provided that we associate this return with the 16th century and not the 19th century. In the 16th century, the gradual reversal begins of the opposition between individual genius and collective industry into that between unskilled mass production and small-scale neo-crafters. By contrast, the 19th century is based on desingularization, such that the craftsperson is less a mediator between conception and execution than simply the enemy of the machine that produces non-biodegradable trash. The contemporary convergence of art, craft, and design, by contrast, is about resingularization. Instead of standardization, design processes happen among or within machinic modes of production in the forms of a testing of new materials, customization of technologies, and an active care for their waste, just as contemporary technology turns design into a kind of generalized craftsmanship. Artistically speaking, The return of craftsmanship and Mannerist virtuosity marks a rematerialization of the art object. Socioeconomically speaking, it undoes the traditional division of labor between the conceptual and executional moments, now that work has become increasingly networked and immaterial. Ecologically speaking, craftsmanship puts us back in touch with shared social and material conditions of production. Of course, many of today's so-called workshops, labs, and breeding grounds are not productive spaces but places for the incapacitating consumption of originality. The use of handmade sketches, which characterizes the design process of architects like Renzo Piano or Frank Gehry, merely leads to an affected illusion of a proper engagement with matter. Ultimately, this is also the problem of Sennett's approach to craftsmanship, which never arrives at the question of technology. In both cases, craft is no more than a false concretion of the real abstraction of money and technoscience, which is itself based on the ever-increasing split between intellectual labor and manual labor. If craftsmanship is to mean anything today, it must therefore be based on the reversal of the old idea that it is possible to design without making.
The very last line there, what does that mean? If craftsmanship is meant to mean anything today, it must therefore be based on the reversal of the old idea that it is possible to design without making. That it's possible to make without designing.
It's the reversal of that it's possible to design without making, but I'm not familiar with that idea at all, that it's possible to design something without making something. That's an interesting one. I did really resonate with a lot of the discussion on the tediousness and painfulness of making something look good, given the collages, and also the idea that in making something we make ourselves, because that usually is the process for something that you work on intensely. It's similar to something Joby was saying in one of our previous discussions of when you're working on a collage, you start getting ideas in the process of making the collage and you start incorporating those ideas. You don't have the whole idea set out. But there's also an inverse to that too, where through the making of the collage that takes forever, there is an influence on you too as well. Through the process of making page 15, I had to go back and learn about why lucha is a Mannerist conception, which influenced my ways of thinking about Mannerism for the thesis in a very direct manner.
So have you bought into the Mannerist reading of Lucha?
Yes. It basically This one is interesting because I feel like the old is a condition of the new. Does it have to always pertain to mannerism? Isn't that just how influence works? Is it necessarily mannerist to influence? But yeah, if you're looking at it like it's cosmopolitical, or it's another use of the old, or it's the old as a condition of the new, or you could look at it as similar to spolia in certain mannerist forms of architecture, then lucha is definitely Mannerist.
My reading of it was it's simply the timeless idea with a lot of historical tropes carried around it, but it's in the art form of today, in the language of today.
So in that sense, it's not enough to say that because something influences something that it's Mannerist, because it necessarily has to have that carryover of the previous template, at least in some form.
Today, anime as possible is like a very popular thing. So it's just they've made use of that language. It's something that's instant, like an anime character is today instantly recognizable.
And also, part of the carryover in Lucha is all of the biblical symbols in that. So she's wearing a rosary, she has the walking stick.
Which actually you're not really meant to wear, but modern people, you see a lot of hip hop artists and fashionista type people wear rosary beads. You're not actually really meant to wear them. People do it. So now the church is like throwing it back that she's actually wearing the rosary beads.
But yeah, you have the Holy See in Lucha, that iconic yellow in the sailor's raincoat. You have the Christian boat there in the raincoat.
Oh, and she has a ship's anchor as well, and that's actually an even older symbol than Christianity, but it's become a Christian icon or piece of iconography.
What I found in that, sure, he writes socio-economically speaking, it undoes the traditional division of labor between the conceptual and executional moments. Now the work has become increasingly network and immaterial. It's not really necessarily connected to that, but what I found very like an interesting observation in the past years is that crafting something yourself, especially if it's like a material object, so not like writing something necessarily, but like actually doing something with like wood or whatever, is such an enriching activity for yourself.
Can that also include editing a video?
No.
Well, honestly, for me,
Or creating one of those art pieces?
For me personally, there's a difference between doing something digitally and actually having tools in your hand and like the stuff that you work with, having it in your hand and seeing it change. That's something that working on in a digital way cannot represent. And if you think about it, it's really an antithesis against the current culture of mechanical reproduction. If you build something out of wood, for example, a little drawer or whatever, you go out of your way to be less efficient than any mechanical reproduction or production rather would be, but I still do it because it's more than just creating a thing that you then use. It's the whole process.
What do you think about the technical object things on there after hearing Leo's talk about the technical object? And then we see it come up in the very last chapter here. There's an interesting one in there where I've thought about it before. Why don't they make all the jars in the supermarket standard sizes? So you don't have some weird fancy jars where it's hard to get the last bit of the product out of them. But if they were all standardized, they could all be washed out and recycled. When I was growing up, the milk used to be delivered to your house, to your letterbox, in glass bottles with a tinfoil cap, and you would put tokens in your letterbox if you wanted milk. You would buy tokens from the local corner shop, these little plastic tokens. They looked a bit like bread bag tokens, the bread bag clips, and they were a little bit chunkier. But you would put your empty milk bottles there with tokens in them, and the milkman would come around in a truck in the morning and take the empty bottles and then put whatever milk there, what you'd left tokens out for. And the milk bottles went back to the place. They were washed out and then they were refilled with milk. And they put a new tinfoil cap, sterilized, and then refilled, put a new tinfoil cap on. And then in the 90s, everything went towards plastic bottles that are pretty much unrecyclable. And there's no more milk delivery anymore. For me, the 1980s was the pinnacle of human civilization. And we've only gone backwards since then, especially the hair, the fashion, and also quality television programs like Sky Commander Bismarck.
In Germany, in that time, in West Germany, almost everybody was doing very well. And the inequality difference between people who earned a lot and people who didn't earn that much was much less than it is now. The earning difference between a blue-collar worker and the manager was much less than it is now. It was way closer together. And a lot of other things just worked better. The system was more social.
I had one thing here. The phrase, the old idea that it is possible to design without making refers to a philosophical perspective in design and architecture that suggests one can conceptualize and plan designs without the necessity of physically creating them. This idea contrasts with the practice of making, where the act of creating a physical object informs and influences the design process itself. The origins of this concept can be traced back to various movements in design and architecture, particularly in the 20th century, and notably the Bauhaus movement emphasized the integration of art and craftsmanship, asserting that making, or the act of physically creating, is essential to the design process. In contrast, some modernist and postmodernist theories have suggested that design can be approached more conceptually, relying on theoretical frameworks or digital tools without the need for physical prototypes. And that is really the way it is now. In contemporary discussions, this idea often surfaces in debates about digital design, rapid prototyping, and the role of technology in the creative process. Some argue that digital tools allow for a design process that is more abstract, while others advocate for the importance of tactile engagement and the physicality of making as a way to inform and refine design ideas.
I'm leaning way to
You're
the
part of the
yeah,
hands-on making
yeah.
camp.
Just imagine somebody designing a mouse and never
Never
actually
having
having
used
it in
it.
your hands. And then you go to a factory and produce 10,000 of these, and you touch one and it's not ergonomic at all.
Isn't that like a politician designing a healthcare system when a politician has never worked as a doctor and doesn't
No,
actually know how it
it's
works?
not even worse. Even worse. I can only speak for Germany, but the thing here is that you have the state-regulated health insurance and you have private health insurance. And like 90% of people are in the public health insurance system, and the top 10% earners are the private one. Politicians as well. And there is a qualitative difference between the two systems. So they design a system which they will never be a part of and will never have to endure, is maybe the
Experience.
wrong phrase. They always be away from the system.
Something this is reminding me of is basically the preferencing of substance over modes that Sajord talks about. And I get what he's talking about now with the sense that we must reverse the old idea that it's possible to design without making. Because in a sense, what he's talking about is the necessity to bring making back into the design process. And so I've brought up this example before, but it's like with the first chair that Charles Eames designed. He thought of the design first and then went to make the chair. The chair won whatever competition that he was in, but they found that they could not possibly reproduce the chair for mass consumption, so they couldn't make a second chair. And so the project just stopped there. And he basically said something very similar. I am always going to start from the materials first from now on and work from there instead of starting from the design and the idea and forcing it onto the materials.
Well, that goes into an argument that goes towards the Bauhaus of truth to materials, where you can do this with wood. So that is what should be done to the wood. This stone can be carved, so it should be carved or sculpted. And those ideas are with Gottfried Semper, who was mentioned in the last one. But what I was going to come back to is this fits into my idea of Mannerism as a Gothic return, because in Gothic architecture, the architects actually built small scale models in stone and tested out whether it could actually hold the weight. And then they just multiplied it and scaled it up. But Gothic architecture, the original Gothic architecture, it was really based on making these small models and making the thing and then building the full building when they had the balance and when they knew it was structurally sound.
I remember you saying that there was a technological breakthrough in the Romanesque architecture that allowed for the Gothic architecture to emerge. Do you know if there were technological breakthroughs for each of the differences in Gothic architecture, from like Gothic primitive to Gothic ornamental to Gothic flamboyant?
Yes, you could think of it as people building, and then it's a dialectic. People build, and then they improved and tested and pushed the boundaries. So, one of the things is what people call pointed arches. Before pointed arches, a little bit more rounded, they had a little sort of lip at the top. And these are described by one architectural historian as pointed webs. And I'm just going to post this picture here. So, this is called bar tracery, and this is a pointed arch. But if you see, this is called flamboyant, and it has this sort of double curve. But if you see, all of that is actually structural. It looks decorative, and it is decorative, but it actually disperses the weight of the window down. So it's beautiful and functional. In the earlier ones, it's not as elaborate as this. But if you look right at the top of it, you see this little lozenge, this little diamond, and then two rounded wedge shapes. Imagine the weight going down in a straight line from from the tip of the point of the immediately you've got this little diamond lozenge, and then it's got a little bit of stone and lead holding that, and then there you've got the circle of the rose window, and then it's all fragmented, and each part it's dispersing, breaking up the weight and dispersing it down from that middle point. Because if you imagine the middle point is pushing straight down in a line, and what all of this ornament is doing is dispersing the weight out to the sides and dispersing it away from the center, so it can hold the weight of this great window. The window is obviously, the glass is lighter than the stone, so that is a technological breakthrough. That's the Gothic flamboyant, the last phase of the Gothic.